Well, hello and welcome to another porch chat on Rare Classic Cars. It's a wonderful day in the winter in the Midwest here again. So we're going to talk about a favorite topic that is going to be emotional for some folks. Worst GM engines. This is not in a ranked order, by the way. I think it's probably hard to rank worst things. They're all bad. But I won't say worst GM engines of all time either, because I'm not all that familiar with, their 1908 powertrains and things from back when they started. But let's call it of that malaise era, 70s, 80s period, when GM unfortunately churned out quite a few stinkers when it came to the engines and even in the transmissions as well. But this is my brief list. And we'll start with the first one up there, the Cadillac HT High-Tech 4100 engine. Yes, the HT did stand for high technology. This engine came out in 1982, and it made all of a whopping 125, 135 horsepower over its lifetime. And it was rushed really into production to meet CAFE or the fuel economy standards. And you can imagine having a 125, 135 horsepower engine in a 4,000 pound plus car. Not good. So this poor motor was tasked with basically powering cars that it really wasn't designed for. It was designed to be a part of the C cars that came out in 1985, like the DeVille. It was supposed to be powering that, and that C car was supposed to come out before. It was not supposed to be an 85 model year car. It was supposed to be, I think, an 83 model year car originally. But that got delayed, and then Cadillac really needed to help the company hit the fuel economy targets, so they dumped this HT 4100 engine in the large rear-wheel drive cars. And aside from it not being powerful, which was a challenge on its own, this car was an aluminum block engine in a suit of iron, if you will. So the main philosophy was that all of the wear components that would experience wear would be made of iron, but the block would be aluminum. So the cylinder head was iron. It had cast iron cylinder liners. GM had learned from another engine that's on here, the Chevy Vega engine, to make sure that you have some sort of a cylinder liner, at least if you're GM. But the problem with this motor was a number of things. The first, I would say, is this mixed metal strategy of the aluminum block, iron head, aluminum intake, coupled with GM really trying to get away from gaskets to save cost and using RTV to seal off different passages and as a proxy for gasketing. So RTV, you have to have absolutely clean surfaces, and when you have metals expanding and contracting at different rates, aluminum and iron don't expand and contract at the same rates. So imagine you got the aluminum intake, an iron head, and aluminum block all expanding and contracting really at different rates with one another as the motor warms up or cools down. It's tough to keep that sealed. And so these cars, in addition to other issues like soft camshafts, they also just suffered from typically blowing the intake gasket. Then that would cause the oil to mix with the coolant. That would chew up your bearings and your camshaft and your crankshaft. And then the car would overheat as well, and then it would blow the head gasket. These had a ton of problems, so many so the Cadillac had to actually create a powertrain warranty just for these that extended beyond the typical bumper-to-bumper warranty to reassure customers that they would fix the motor if it had any issues. But these engines, I would say, I think that the issue of being mixed metals coupled with being dumped in really heavy cars, it's cold out. Customers would go start up their car, it's cold, they go pull out on the main road while the motor isn't warmed up and probably had to floor it to get up to speed, which just puts unnatural stresses and strains internally on the motor and causes more of the issues that we were just talking about. So really, especially in the early years, 1982 to 1985, they did do some redesigns in 85 through 87 to improve the motor, but it just wasn't really a good one to have. Now, in spite of this, I will say I've owned about 4 cars with that motor, and I've never had any problems with them. But you have to do a couple things. Do not push the motor. First of all, these motors aren't strong, and the transmissions that often back them, like the 440 T4, are not strong either. So don't push the motor hard. Drive it normally. Second, when it's cold, let the motor warm up before you accelerate with any sort of alacrity at all. I used to always drive mine like I had an egg under my foot until it went up to operating temperature. And then third, you have to change the coolant relatively frequently. I change mine every 2 to 3 years, and you must use for the GM sealing tabs, which are basically the bars leaks, those pellets. You need to use that. That is factory service procedure on these. It also is for the early North Stars too, by the way. And that has its own issues, leads to sometimes clogged heater cores, but you must follow those procedures when, if you want these motors to live. And I will say, they're reliable until they aren't, until they have a catastrophic failure. I've had them as daily drivers. They do get really good mileage. I have an 84 Seville that routinely gets 24, 25 miles per gallon freeway. I had an 85 DeVille that would get 26 on the freeway. So they do deliver good mileage. And in the in the downside front wheel drive C bodies, they're actually pleasant. They're very smooth. And I will also just say, don't buy one with high miles. All the ones that I've had have low miles. In general, the lifetime of that motor is, I would say, 100,000 miles. Yes, there are people who get more out of them, but I wouldn't budget much beyond that. Like I said, they did have often soft camshafts, and the water pumps weren't very good. That would also cause overheating. The coolant fan modules on the front-wheel drive cars weren't that reliable, so that would cause overheating. And try to get one if you're going to get one with low miles, and just budget for you may have challenges, although I will say I never have. Second, Oldsmobile V8 diesel, both the 350 and 261 cubic inch. I noticed I didn't say the Olds V6 diesel, which came out in 1982, but the Olds V8 diesel was essentially a gas engine, an Olds 350 cubic inch motor that General Motors took and dieselized, for lack of a better term, and rushed to market, again, to meet the CAFE standards. We've talked about that in another video. And it was underdeveloped in a number of areas. I would say most prominently the head bolts were not strong enough in the early years in particular. And GM, for cost reasons, didn't have water separators or ways to eliminate the water or filter out the water in the fuel very well. And diesel fuel attracts moisture quite readily. So most every diesel engine, before or since, has some sort of a water separator system. And diesel fuel during that time in the U.S. just also wasn't that great a quality. So you can imagine water is not compressible, so that's a bad thing. And you don't want water getting into the injector pump and its seals. The injector pumps also had some issues, but I would call those relatively minor in the grand scheme of things compared to the head bolts and the lack of a water separator. And again, the car wasn't that powerful. It was those motors were 105 to 120 horsepower, again in 4,000 pound cars plus often. And I think again that, people start those up, went on the main road, floored it, put a lot of stresses on all those head bolts that were undersized, blew the head gaskets. Not good. Now, the later ones, when they came out with what's called the DX block, were a bit better. But I would say, the 1978, 79 model year ones in particular are somewhat troublesome. And I think people also didn't like having to turn the key on and wait to start, albeit by 79 they had fast-working glow plugs. So I had a 79 Seville diesel, actually. It was my daily driver, and even if it were 0 degrees outside, you'd turn the key on, you'd wait 6 or 7 seconds, and it was ready to start. And I, again, never had an issue. But I always drove it gingerly until it warmed up, and I changed the oil frequently. Oil in diesels gets really dirty really quickly, and just as an insurance policy, I was frequently changing my oil probably every couple thousand miles. And the car was reliable. I never had any problems with it. I think a lot of people pushed the maintenance interval on the oil change as well. It didn't have an oversized oil filter. It was just a standard PF24, whatever the GM used during the time. So, again, not a great one. And that motor was also standard in the 1980 Cadillac Seville. So 2 Cadillac motors on the bad list here in a relatively short period of time. And there's going to be another one that we'll get to. The third, the Chevrolet Vega 2.3 liter, especially from before the 1976 model year when it was rebranded, I believe the Dura something. I think it was Dura-Built. But again, another aluminum block, this time with no cast iron cylinder liners. Had a cast iron head, was an overhead cam engine. But aluminum does not wear nearly as well as cast iron. Cast iron is much more rigid. Cast iron is a phenomenal material. You have graphite in basically the iron or carbon precipitates that make it self-lubricating. So when it's under stresses, that graphite and the carbon that is an alloying element of it is helpful to provide anti-wear. And for this engine, GM tried to have a coating, a silicon coating, to try to eliminate or reduce the wear in the engines. And long story short, it didn't work. Now and so the cars became oil burners pretty quickly. And in 1976, GM redid the engine, redid the cooling system for it as well, and rebranded it, and then had an ad campaign showing these vehicles going through the desert, putting 60,000 miles on them with no issues. And they extended the powertrain warranty to 5 years, 60,000 miles to convince customers they had cured all the issues, but it was too late by then. In any case, the early ones became oil burners quickly, perhaps because of that lack of the cylinder liner. But the interesting thing is who picked up that technology and ran with it later? BMW. Now, it didn't prove overly successful for them either, but more successful than it did for General Motors. And so the Vega, those motors, not great. The cars rusted fast, et cetera, et cetera. But, if you have to pick one up from 76 or 77 model year with a better engine. And interestingly, I believe that's the first GM car with an electric in-tank fuel pump. So, or it's certainly one of the first. And also, GM trying to save money and get the customer to pay more for service. I think it's the only GM car I know of where to replace the air cleaner filter, you must replace the housing. You cannot separate the housing and the filter, which is crazy, but that's how they were. Oh, poor Cadillac. Next one, the Cadillac V864. Only introduced in the 1981 model year, and it lasted 1 year in passenger cars. The limousines, if you're a limousine driver, you had to put up with it for a little while longer. But, displacement on demand is pretty common now. A lot of cars use displacement on demand. But back in the early 80s, this was novel, and it went from 8 cylinders to 6 under reduced load down to 4. And in particular, the 6-cylinder mode was imbalanced, and the motor kind of shook a little bit, and it just wasn't reliable. The system overall wasn't reliable. Now, this was a fine motor on its own. This is the Cadillac 368 cubic inch motor that had started life as a 472, went up to 500, went down to 425 in 1977, then down to 368 in 1980. So the motor itself was reliable, all cast iron, but and if you disable the system, the motor is just fine, and that's what a lot of people ended up doing. But as engineered, a throttle body injected displacement on demand system that closes off the valves. Ideally, you want to have port injection so you can shut down individual injectors at each cylinder, not have a wet intake, that's for these cylinders that are shut off. But that was how it was done. And they had a lot of reliability issues, not good. It wasn't like I said, aside from that, it was not a bad motor. But the V864 was not great, and obviously later on, GM brought the technology back, although it took 20 plus years. Last, the Chevrolet produced 1.8 liter inline 4-cylinder in 1982. In 1982 model year only, introduced in the J cars, the Cavalier J2000, Forenza, Skyhawk, and Cimarron. And it's bad when, when the OE changes the engine after just half of a model year, which is what happened. They ended up stroking this 1.8 liter engine to 2 liters. And it was about 80 horsepower, but it made the torque really up high in the RPM range, so it just was absolutely gutless, even in a small car like the J car. And so GM stroked it and made it a 2 liter very quickly. But Motor Week, I think, tested a Cimarron, a 1982 Cimarron with this engine, and I believe it was 18 to 19 seconds, 0 to 60. Now, the big rear-wheel drive cars with the 4.1 and even the Eldorado and Seville were, the Eldorado and Seville from 1982 to 85, were about 16 to 18 seconds, 0 to 60. Ugh. This V8 diesel, those cars were about 18, 19 seconds, 0 to 60. The Chevrolet 1.8 liter powered cars, like I said, the Cimarron, I think it was 18 to 19 seconds. You know it's bad when Motor Week tested an 83 Cimarron with a 2 liter and they raved about it because it shaved 3 seconds off of the 0 to 60 time, or nearly 3 seconds. So it went from 18 to 19 seconds down to 15 to 16. Wow. But just a terrible motor, terrible, noisy, raucous, underpowered, even in a small car. So it's so bad that it was changed after just half of a model year. So the last thing I'll point out on this list is how many of these motors were on Cadillacs. 1, 2, 3, 4. All during a very short period of time. This is the oldest that came out in 1978, and as I mentioned, this Olds V8 diesel was standard on the 1980 Seville. You could get the 368 Cadillac motor as a no-cost option, the gas motor. But this was standard, and it was troublesome. Then, so you have this as a starting point being troublesome. Then you go to this, which is troublesome. Then you go to this, which is troublesome in the full-size cars. And then you have this in the Cimarron. It's no wonder why Cadillac share just went during that time period. And I really feel, I don't know if I feel bad for them, but I do feel bad for the people who worked on those cars during that time frame. The engines and transmissions really just were not up to par, and I think led to the very accelerated share losses that they experienced during that time. In Cadillac, it really took until kind of the 1992 Eldorado Seville for them to get their mojo back a little bit. But those, if you want to chart Cadillac market share and the introduction of those 4 engines, you can almost just make a line down as customers get fed up with those engines and having to drive those cars. So I hope you enjoyed this little personal opinion about the worst General Motors engines made. And unfortunately, a lot of these were coupled to the worst General Motors transmissions made too, which can be a separate video. But this was attached to the 440 T4 in the front-wheel drive cars. This was attached to Turbo Hydromatic 200s and 200Cs. The early Turbo Hydromatic 125 wasn't all that great either. So not a good combination, not good years for General Motors. In any case, hope you enjoyed this porch chat. Stay warm, everyone, and take care. Thanks for watching this porch chat. Please like and subscribe. Hopefully you enjoyed the discussion on worst GM engines of all time. We can certainly discuss other automakers. But in any case, please subscribe and email me at rareclassiccars@yahoo.com with any comments or questions. Thanks again and take care.